Jami-Lee Ross.
Mr Speaker, earlier today the report of the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee on the Treaty of... thank you, Mr Cunliffe. Gosh, if I say. Earlier today, Mr Speaker, the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee's report into the treaty examination of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was presented to the House. That report, Mr Speaker, was a culmination of 2.5 months' worth of hearings, 650 oral submissions heard, and a further 6,000 odd submissions received by the committee and considered by the committee. It's by no means as much of a feat as those who negotiated the agreement, but it was, Mr Speaker, quite an effort, and I acknowledge the chairman of the committee, Mark Mitchell, who's here at the moment. Mr Speaker, the committee considered many aspects of that treaty and ultimately came down to the view that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is of considerable benefit to New Zealand, considerable benefit to New Zealand exporters, and Mr Speaker, it is going to be a trade agreement which will be one in which will go down in history as being a leader around the world for trade for the world. Mr Speaker, it's a trade agreement that covers 1/3 of world trade. It's a trade agreement that covers 800 million people living within the countries that are there, and Mr Speaker, 40% of the world's total economic output goes through the countries that are part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Mr Speaker, throughout the hearings it became clear to us that there was a huge amount of misinformation being peddled by groups around the country. The largest group that was peddling misinformation, Mr Speaker, I believe, was the New Zealand Labour Party. And Mr Speaker, a party which has had a proud history of supporting trade and supporting exporters in this country, have abandoned New Zealand exporters, abandoned those people trying to produce products to export around this world. And I see Mr Cunliffe and Mrs King and Mr Parker in the House, who were ministers in the last government, who quite rightly should have been proud to stand on their feet and support free trade agreements that the Labour Party supported, Mr Speaker, but they have abandoned New Zealanders on this case. Mr Speaker, submitters came to the committee talking about the need to allow the government to legislate in the public interest. TPP does not stop that. Mr Speaker, submitters came to the House concerned that the ISDS, Investor-State Dispute Settlement provisions, would harm New Zealand. In fact, Mr Speaker, they protect New Zealand investments. They don't harm New Zealand at all. And Mr Speaker, there are a lot of protections built in there. They were concerned about the Farm Act model being threatened. Well, the government protected the Farm Act model. They were concerned about the Treaty of Waitangi being the Treaty of Waitangi having an issue taken with it. Well, Mr Speaker, the government protected the Treaty of Waitangi. They were concerned about jobs potentially being lost. Well, Mr Speaker, there was a very poor report produced that was hung on to by many submitters. But in fact, Mr Speaker, we can say with our hands on our hearts that through trade agreements that governments have negotiated in the past, it only leads to more jobs, more growth, more opportunity for New Zealanders, and TPP will do that as well. Mr Speaker, there were a number of minority reports submitted, and I acknowledge the Green Party and the New Zealand First Party for their very principled minority reports, but there were some inaccuracies in some of the minority reports. The biggest inaccuracy in the minority reports from the New Zealand Labour Party was a statement that goes, the Labour Party is the party of free trade. That is the biggest inaccuracy I saw in any of the minority reports. Mr Speaker, after the introduction, the first 5 paragraphs of the Labour Party's minority report was not about economic gains, it was not about trade, it was about housing. The second 2 paragraphs after the housing paragraphs were about process. It wasn't until the 9th paragraph into the Labour Party's minority report that they actually talked about trade. Mr Speaker, they have abandoned the country on trade. They no longer support exporters. And in fact, to stand up in the House and write into a report that they are opposed to $2.7 billion worth of economic gain because the National Party government didn't negotiate the ability for them in the future to ban foreigners based on the sound of their last name, Mr Speaker, is terrible. Mr Speaker, they say in their report that they have a long-held Labour policy of banning foreigners. It wasn't so long-held that they were hanging on to that when they were in government and started the negotiations on TPP. But, Mr Speaker, they're using that to say no to hundreds of millions, in fact billions of dollars worth of export opportunities for this country. The Select Committee did a good job in considering many of these matters. It is undoubtedly in New Zealand's best interest to ratify TPP, and I'm pleased to be on that committee that supported it.
Yeah.